Trump's 50% tariffs are no longer a threat hanging over Canada. They're now law. They took effect at midnight on Saturday, and Mark Carney's response wasn't to keep negotiating, it was to walk his entire team out of the room. "We cannot accept what they have offered, and we will not give what they have asked," Carney told reporters in Ottawa before delivering the line that's now everywhere, "You're at war when you get attacked. We got attacked." Canada is hitting back with its own dollar-for-dollar tariffs starting September 8th, targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, electronics, and farm equipment. This isn't a script anymore about tension building toward a deadline. The deadline came and went, the deal collapsed, and both countries are now officially retaliating against each other in real time. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll walk through exactly how these talks fell apart in the final 48 hours, and because both sides are pointing fingers, the details matter. Then we'll break down precisely what Trump's tariffs actually cover and why they cut through USMCA protections that had shielded Canadian exports for 18 months. After that, we'll get into Canada's retaliation package itself, the specific American sectors getting hit, and the strategic thinking behind targeting dairy specifically. We'll cover Carney's full public explanation for walking away, because his own words reveal exactly what pushed this from tense negotiation into outright breakdown. And finally, we'll talk about what this means for the broader USMCA relationship going forward, because this fight isn't ending on September 8th, it's just entering its next phase. Let's start with how this actually collapsed. According to Reuters, the two countries had spent 3 days in intensive, last-ditch negotiations trying to reach a deal before Trump's deadline. Late Friday night, those talks fell apart entirely, hours before 50% tariffs were set to take effect on $20 billion worth of Canadian exports. Carney said he personally instructed Canadian negotiators to pack up and return to Ottawa rather than sign what was on the table. In his own words delivered from Parliament Hill Saturday morning, "In recent days, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal." CBC News reported the collapse came after the Trump administration introduced late, unacceptable demands touching Canadian culture, autos, and sovereignty, demands that, taken together with the broader pattern of how these talks had gone, convinced Carney the United States wasn't actually interested in what he called a true economic partnership. It's worth sitting with just how far along these talks actually were before they fell apart, because that context makes the collapse even more significant. This wasn't a negotiation stalling out in its early stages. Carney himself acknowledged in a public statement shared on social media that important progress had been made in recent weeks towards what he described as improving Canada's position to have the best deal in the world with the U.S. Reporting on the auto content dispute earlier in the week showed both sides actively working through detailed, sector-specific formulas. Tariff cuts on steel, aluminum, and autos were reportedly close to being finalized. That progress simply didn't survive contact with what Carney called last-minute demands, meaning this wasn't a case of two sides failing to find common ground from the start. It was a case of common ground being found and then pulled out from under the agreement at the final hour. The American side tells a mirrored version of events, and it's worth including both sides honestly here. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said in a statement that Canada declined to finalize the trade deal under the terms agreed earlier this week, adding that despite an American offer for Canada to receive what he called the best treatment of any major exporter to the U.S. market, new demands and walkbacks of other commitments by Canada had upended the balance both sides had reached. Greer told Fox News Saturday morning bluntly, "We don't have new talks planned with the Canadians. We've said enough, and so we've taken countermeasures." Both governments agree the deal fell apart in the final hours. They simply disagree entirely on who moved the goalposts. That disagreement over who's actually responsible matters beyond simple blame assigning too, because it shapes how each side is likely to approach the next attempt at negotiation. If Washington genuinely believes Canada walked back previously agreed commitments, that colors how much trust American negotiators bring to any future talks. If Ottawa genuinely believes the U.S. introduced sovereignty-touching demands at the 11th hour specifically to extract last-minute concessions, that colors how much latitude Canadian negotiators are willing to extend going forward. Neither side walking away from this weekend with a clean, uncontested narrative makes the path back to the table considerably murkier than a simple missed deadline would. Now, let's look at what actually took effect. Trump's 50% tariffs hit a wide range of Canadian goods: wine, furniture, dairy products, cement, clothing, fishing rods, and hockey equipment, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian exports, about 5% of everything Canada ships to the United States annually. The specifics range from the symbolically loaded to the almost absurd. Reporting noted the list includes everything from hockey sticks to tongue depressors. Here's the detail that matters most, though. These duties do not exempt Canadian products under USMCA, the trade agreement that had shielded the vast majority of Canadian exports to the US for the past 18 months. That protection is now gone for every product on this list, a meaningful escalation beyond anything in this trade war so far. Carney didn't wait to announce Canada's response. Canada will match Washington's new tariffs dollar for dollar in order to protect Canadian workers, farmers, families, and businesses, he said, with the retaliation set to take effect September 8th, the Tuesday after Labor Day. The targeted American sectors are steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, plus products the U.S. had previously targeted in earlier rounds of this dispute. Trade analysts have already flagged the dairy inclusion as strategically significant, not just retaliation for retaliation's sake, but a deliberate marker laid down ahead of a bigger negotiation still to come over Canadian supply management and American market access, positioning dairy as a two-way lever. Canada controls rather than a one-way American demand. There's a reason the specific choice of sectors here deserves closer attention than a simple list of names suggests. Steel and dairy in particular sit at the intersection of American political sensitivity and genuine Canadian leverage. Steel, because American producers have spent years lobbying for exactly the kind of protection tariffs like this were originally meant to provide. And dairy because it touches a politically powerful U.S. farm lobby that watches trade negotiations closely. By naming these sectors specifically, rather than spreading retaliation thin across dozens of minor categories, Canada is signaling it intends this response to actually be felt in Washington, not simply logged as a symbolic gesture. Agricultural equipment and electronics round out a package that touches manufacturing, farming, and industrial supply chains simultaneously. A broad enough spread that few American export-facing industries escape this round entirely untouched. Carney's own framing of this moment was about as direct as diplomatic language gets. Asked whether Canada considers this an actual trade war, he didn't hedge, "You're at war when you get attacked. We got attacked." That's a notable escalation in tone from a prime minister who spent most of this year-long dispute choosing carefully measured, restrained language, even while absorbing tariff after tariff. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, one of the most vocal voices throughout this entire fight, backed the retaliation publicly, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's CEO, Candice Lang, said the organization would be, in her words, mobilizing our network of businesses in all regions and all sectors to brace for impact and make the best of a bad situation. This shift in Carney's own language is worth measuring against everything that came before it throughout this dispute. This is the same prime minister who, months earlier, was repeatedly using the phrase maîtres chez nous, masters in our own home, careful, historically resonant language aimed at signaling resolve without ever using the World War. That restraint is now gone. When the head of a government explicitly reaches for combat language, on the record, in a formal press conference, that's a deliberate rhetorical choice meant to prepare the public for a longer, harder confrontation than anything Canada has previously signaled it was bracing for in this entire trade dispute. To be fair, this breakdown doesn't necessarily mean the relationship is permanently broken beyond repair. Both governments have walked away from talks before during this dispute, and eventually returned to the table, and Trump himself reportedly expressed hope a deal could still happen as recently as Friday, before the last-minute demands derailed things. There's also a 17-day window between now and September 8th when Canada's retaliation actually takes effect, real-time during which further talks could theoretically still happen, even if neither side currently has anything scheduled. And crucially, the broader USMCA framework itself technically remains intact, still running through 2036 on paper, even though the mandatory annual review triggered back on July 1st means this entire relationship is now up for renegotiation every single year, rather than settling into any long-term certainty. But look at what this moment actually represents regardless of what happens next. For 18 months, USMCA protections had shielded most Canadian exports from the worst of this trade war, giving businesses on both sides some baseline predictability, even as tariffs escalated around the edges. That protection is now gone for $20 billion of goods, and Canada didn't respond by absorbing the hit quietly. The way it might have a year ago, it responded within hours with a fully specified dollar-for-dollar counter-package targeting American steel, dairy, and manufacturing sectors by name. This is Canada, 18 months into building alternative markets in Europe and Asia, redirecting aluminum exports, signing new defense deals with Germany, and diversifying trade away from total U.S. dependence, finally showing Washington exactly how much has changed since this fight started. So that's the full picture. A trade deal that collapsed in its final hours, a 50% tariff now actually in effect rather than just threatened, and a Canadian Prime Minister who didn't blink, matching Washington's escalation dollar for dollar and calling it exactly what it is, an attack that got a response. Whatever happens between now and September 8th, this weekend has already reset the baseline for how this entire relationship gets discussed going forward. Every future round of talks, whether it happens next month or next year, now has to be measured against the fact that a deal genuinely close to completion still collapsed at the final hour, and that both governments were willing to let it collapse rather than sign something either side considered unacceptable. That's a different negotiating environment than the one this dispute started in 18 months ago, back when the assumption on both sides was that some deal, almost any deal, was better than an open trade war. That assumption no longer appears to hold on either side of the border. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Do you think this gets resolved before September 8th? Or is Canada and the US genuinely settling in for a longer trade war now?